When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us every week for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Gregg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. Welcome to this episode of our podcast, Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. We're so happy to have Leslie Ross-Degnan back with us for another episode of looking at a book that has themes around oldishness. Today, the book we're going to be looking at, guided by Leslie, is The Mostly True Story of Tanner and Louise by Colleen Oakley. Leslie is a published poet and author and bring her expertise and oldishness to this conversation. So welcome, Leslie.
Thanks, Janet. Colleen Oakley's book, The Mostly True Story of Tanner and Louise. Just a little bit about Colleen Oakley. She's from Atlanta. She's an Atlanta-based writer and a former editor and writer before she became an author. She lives in Atlanta, Georgia with her husband and her 4 children. And, with 4 children, I wonder when she has time to write. She said in an interview that I saw that she writes when her kids are at school, which makes sense. And that obviously works for her because this is her 5th novel. She wrote her first novel, Before I Go, in 2015, then another in 2017, 2020, and 2021. And the mostly true story of Tanner and Louise was written last year in 2023. And she has a new book coming out next year in 2025. So she's busy. She's been really prolific. This new one is called Jane and Dan at the End of the World. So I'm going to tell you a little more about some of the tone of some of her novels. They're kind of quirky and they all have unusual characters. And like this book, which we're going to get into in a minute. And she puts her characters in unusual circumstances too. For example, in the 4th book, which I also read, and the title is kind of interesting, is called The Invisible Husband of Brick Island. Brick Island is an island off the coast of New York, around the Hudson Bay area. And it's a funny story. It's about a woman who loses her husband out to sea. They do clams, I guess, out there. And she just can't deal with it. So she pretends that he's still alive. And that's actually not too odd. Some people do that when they lose a loved one. But the odd thing about it is that the whole island goes along with it. And they also pretend that they see her husband, that he's still alive. And that makes it interesting. And then a reporter comes to the island and he's like, "What's going on here? This guy is not around." And everybody's talking to him and talking about him. So anyway, she's an interesting writer and she likes to turn things on their heads and make things a little bit different. She calls The Mostly True Story of Tanner and Louise a road trip book. A road trip book is something that she always wanted to write. And of course, this title might bring another title to your mind. They made a movie out of it, is the story about Thelma and Louise. So just let me give you this brief synopsis and feel free to jump in on this of The Mostly True Story of Tanner and Louise by Colleen Oakley. The main character is 84-year-old Louise. She's being pressured by her adult children to get some help, outside help, after she's had a hip injury. So she hires this young woman, Tanner, who's 21, and who needs a place to live and a job while she sorts out what she's doing in her life, which has fallen apart. Tanner was in college. She's a college student and she was on the soccer team. She was a big star in the soccer team. She loved soccer. And then she had an injury from a fall. So she's home living with her parents and not enjoying that too much. And so she reluctantly takes this caretaking job, seeing it as a temporary thing. She's wallowing in her misery about what am I going to do with my life at home and not too many future plans, really. Louise, on the other hand, has lived a lot more life than Tanner, obviously. She's very independent. And she kind of resents the need for any physical assistance because of her, independence. And she wants a caretaker even less than Tanner wants to be one. So they start their time together kind of ignoring each other. Tanner plays her video games constantly, 5 hours at a go, while Louise is out doing her life at the hairdresser or the doctor's office or playing bridge with her friends or watching her television programs at like 4:00 on the dot. Like she tells Tanner, well, you can play video games till the cows come home, but you have to stop at 4:00 because I have to watch my programs, right? So one day when Louise is out, Tanner meets the neighbor who doesn't really like Louise and tells her that Louise came over to her house once and threatened her husband with a gun. And Tanner's like, whoa, wait a minute, this does not jive with this old lady that I'm taking care of. What's going on here? So she's shocked. So she goes home and starts looking around the house for that gun. And she notices how locked up tight the house is. It's got padlocks. There's even a shed in the back with a big padlock on it. And Tanner starts to wonder what Louise is hiding. Why does she have all these locks everywhere? What's going on? So I think it's either that night, Tanner sees a news report about a jewel thief on the run after 48 years. And the reporter shows an artist's rendition of what the thief would look like today in their 80s. And she's shocked because this looked a lot like Louise. So Tanner's imagination's like starting to run away with her. She doesn't know what's going on. Then a few days later, in the middle of the night, Louise bursts into Tanner's bedroom and says, pack your bags. We're going on a road trip. And the adventure begins. And then that's the whole story. And there's a lot of mystery. There's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of characters coming and going. And Tanner is freaked out by all this, full of nerves. But on the other hand, for the first time in a long time, this young woman, 21-year-old woman, starts to feel alive on this adventure with an 84-year-old woman. It's like a very exciting thing that she's doing in her life. So there it is. That's the synopsis. So what I thought about doing was, there are interesting themes in this book that kind of compare and contrast the main characters, Tanner and Louise. So in ways, comparing and contrasting youth and age. So the first one I started with was following the rules, being a rule breaker. And in this case, they've switched roles versus generally you think that the older character, Louise, would be the rule follower, but it's just the opposite here. Tanner is the big rule follower. And we start out learning about her. And I think because of this, she rigidly follows the speed limit, for example, in the book that drives Louise crazy because she likes to drive fast. And when Tanner thinks about what happened to her school, her soccer team, her college years, she reflects on it in a sad way, thinking that she did everything right. She followed all the rules. She always did the right thing. She got good grades. She wasn't boy crazy. She was a good teammate in college. But somehow she wasn't reaping the benefits that she expected she would by following the rules. So she's just trying to figure this out.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting theme, Leslie. And it's so interesting how these themes can kind of bleed into both arenas, as opposite as they are, 21 and 84. It felt like as I was reading that Louise also was very rigid in a way when Tanner first met her. She had her hair appointment once a week and her bridge game with friends and her shows at 4 and all of that. And Tanner, on the other end, also is showing this rigidity.
Yeah, I think it was a nice way to set the story up where it looked like Tanner was an old woman too. We realized what a rule breaker she was. You get a little more background in her life where she was helping women that were abused by their partners to escape, or she was helping women to seek abortions at a time when it was pretty dangerous to do that. And then she even once said to Tanner, enjoy your life following rules. And I think that, and Tanner took that in. It's like, wait a minute. I'm right about this. 84-year-old calling me a rule follower, which I am. But then during the road trip, Louise is often trying to get Tanner to act more her age, act more like a young person instead of an old person. She's trying to get her to take risks, to live a little, like less predictably and relax a little. She does things like when they were in a hotel, she ordered a whiskey sour at the bar for Louise, who, because she was an athlete, for Tanner rather, because she is an athlete, she didn't drink. So she did, and she got a little tipsy. And after Tanner discovers that Louise has a gun in her suitcase, Louise says, well, you've never seen a gun before? And she said, Tanner's like, no. So she takes her out in the back of the hotel one day and teaches her how to shoot a gun. So then things begin to get more contrasting between the two of them. And they start to look like they're in opposite.
Yeah. And
places.
I actually, what some of the things I wrote down from the book was in that kind of moment as they were shifting to being on the run and all that happened, I wrote down that Tanner was being impacted positively by the example of this oldish person. The quote was, Tanner felt something blossom in her chest, something that felt an awful lot like hope. So I think Louise inadvertently helping Tanner get out of the stuck place she was in around her need for growing identity and changing identity, and that Tanner was stuck. So that moment where she felt something blossom in her chest, something that felt an awful lot like hope.
I think that's a really good point. Tanner is clearly stuck, and she's a rule follower, but she's also a brat. She's selfish, and she yells at her mother and everybody else, and she's angry at everybody. She's really angry, but she's really stuck in that place. One of the ways to get unstuck in life is to change the channel. And Louise is definitely a different channel from the show that Tanner has been watching, the movie that Tanner has been living in. Louise is definitely on a different channel. So that it changes her big time and kind of shocks her out of the place that she's in. Louise has a lot of shocking behaviors, including some that weren't actually hers, but Tanner is very good at jumping to conclusions. So Tanner becomes less bratty as time goes on, gets less out of her head and into being aware of and thinking about other people and how things might respond to them. So she starts to grow up. There's one thing that I read an interview with the author, and she said that the two things about the origin of the book. One is, she said clearly it's a Thelma and Louise book. And the other one is that Louise is based on the author's grandmother, where she did many of the same things, where every day at the same time, she had 2 fingers of vodka. That was her routine, and a lot of the same things.
I saw some interviews too. The author's grandmother had Parkinson's disease, and we discover later on in a very poignant moment between Tanner and Louise that Louise has Parkinson's disease. There was one place where in the nursing home, Louise was talking about, Tanner says, oh, what did you do today? And she said, oh, I went on a submarine trip. And the author says her grandmother she got Alzheimer's and began to talk about these things that she just hallucinated or imagined, that didn't actually really happen. So I thought that was interesting that she brought that in too, Greg. I'm glad you made that point. But I mean, moving on to like other themes, and this is a good segue. Louise was pretty good at overcoming obstacles. She didn't hang out there, whereas Tanner was just wallowing in the mistakes that she made in her life. And maybe that's because her life was so short. She was only 21. And Louise had so much experience in her life and was also trying to get Tanner to act her age. Like you said, I think Tanner was very immature for a lot of reasons, whenever. But I don't think Louise, she was probably born old. She seemed like to be that person, the kind of person that was born old. Yeah. And was going to go out and save the world. She wasn't going to waste any time. She was just going to go out and save the world. But Tanner was really unable to take responsibility and make decisions or even make her own decisions. She was still blaming her friend for the accident, making her go to that party where she fell off a balcony and got injured. And therefore, Tanner was not able to be on the soccer team anymore. And I think Louise, when they met, was at a place in her life where being a mother and a grandmother was starting to become a little humdrum for her compared to her adventures as a young woman anyway. So this is a grand adventure that she's took the lead on, Louise. She had to go out to California to see her friend George and take care of business.
Hey, it just reminded me of another book that we have reviewed together about the old lady who broke all the rules and how she was stuck in this humdrum existence as an oldish person, and a whole different story, but how she decided to break the rules and bring excitement back into her life. And I was also thinking about what you were just saying, Leslie, as far as what Louise had to offer Tanner, how she helped Tanner to mature and have hope, and how we don't think about that with oldish people often. We often don't think that people as they age have anything to offer. So here's this book saying, yeah, oldish people have a lot to offer. And it also, Greg, reminds me of the interview we did in our last episode about sexuality as you age, and how, again, people tend to look at oldish people as not having any desires or interests, including sexual interests. And here's Louise saying, no, not so much. Gonna find that bartender and give him a key to my room. And, even at 84, absolutely.
I know that really shocks Tanner.
Absolutely.
I love that scene. Right. She just goes ahead and gets another room and doesn't even tell Tanner. In the meantime, they're sharing a room, Tanner and Louise, but because Louise gives her key to this bartender, Tanner has to share a room with somebody else.
Or she thinks she does. Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. So
that was the first part of the book that I felt like the characters were human and not sketches. Was when the scene between Louise and the bartender, who was also an older gentleman, shall we say. They were tender with each other. The author was tender with them. I kind of felt as though the author, in doing her research, had been reading Joan Price's books about oldish sexuality and had looked up all the high points. Be careful of my hip. I can't unbutton my own buttons because I have arthritis in my hands, that sort of thing. I like that part a lot. And they really seemed, those two older people, I guess I have an oldish bias. These two oldish people were really sweet and tender with each other. And they each had their own griefs and their own needs and their own desires. And that's where they met. And they were really sweet with each other.
yeah, that's true. They were. It was a very tender scene. I think the writer did a good job of making it a really important scene, in the book, in a moment in the book.
It makes me think about humans and not sketches. I wonder if there was some part of that was intentional, in the sense of that we see both youth and oldish people with sketches, unless we stop to really see someone. So even in that moment, the author could have just written it, So she gave the key and the bartender came and they had sex or they were sexual, whatever that looked like for them. But the fact that she really brought depth and warmth to that moment might have been intentional. But the result was what you're saying, of whether it's intentional or not, is that there was a moment that they were humans. They were being written in a fully human way.
The other thing that I thought would be fun to explore is having second chances in life. We want to talk a little bit about second chances and overcoming adversity, an experience or some kind of tragedy or whatever. Each of these characters experiences a second chance in their life. But Louise, in general, I think she is definitely it's not over till it's over. She has that kind of attitude. She knows how to move through a difficult situation, how to find second chances, how to keep having adventures and relationships And yes, she's older. She feels physical pain now and she has more limitations, but it doesn't seem to keep her down too long. She's still in the stream of life. And Tanner is just reluctant to jump into that life stream and take the kind of risks that Louise has, just jumped into in her life. In some ways, Tanner slows Louise down and makes her think about things a bit and think about righting some of the wrongs that she's done in her past as a young woman. The mail fraud thing that Louise was arrested for and the robbery, as exciting as that was, I think, Tanner sort of, just by her personality, helped Louise kind of reflect on how that might have hurt other people as well. It wasn't just a fun thing she did with her friend. And then later on in the story, she wants to right some of the wrongs with this mafia guy, Salvador D'Amato, who's in a complication in the story. She is trying to help his wife escape him. And then D'Amato is abusive and he beats her up when she's pregnant. And then she goes into premature labor and dies. And then Louise takes her baby then and then disappears because the mother said, please don't let this guy D'Amato raise my child. And so Louise does that. She takes this child and raises her as her own. And then later on in the book, this mafia guy comes looking for her. And then there's an opportunity there for a second chance where she begins to think about this guy. Is this his only kid or one of his few children that he has a right to meet? And she decides she's going to let her daughter, who is his daughter actually, make that decision. But this is what happens towards the end, in some resolution, which I think is really interesting. So I just want to talk about August, the guy in the book that
Brad
Louise. Yeah, right. He's kind of like, swoop my hair back.
He was totally based on Brad Pitt and Thelma and Louise.
That's true. You're right. He was. Yeah. Okay. But thanks to Louise, Tanner meets this young man, August, because he lives in Louise's neighborhood and he's helping her out with odd jobs and such. But Tanner doesn't really develop. She likes him, but she doesn't really develop any kind of relationship with him until they're on the run. And Louise has to get rid of the green Jaguar that she had in the shed that was all locked up. And this is another hint that Louise is, not really such an oldish person. I mean, she has a Jaguar in her shed. She runs off to California.
Well, but it's almost like she is such a complex character as human beings are. So she had this kind of wild life earlier in her adulthood of really pushing against the law and what's legal to help women who are either in domestic violence situations and or need an abortion. And then when she got older, it seems like she had all of that, things locked up. She had a Jaguar in her locked garage, but then she settled into oldishness or becoming older, of just what we talked about earlier, the rigidity of her week and her dealing with the pain and all of that. And I think it says in the book that my take on this writing was that she almost forgot that it was there, and she knew if she needed a quick getaway, she could. And she had cash, she had the car, but that she didn't expect. It seemed like she didn't expect that to happen. And even when Tanner joined her life, it was more, like you said, a nuisance. As she had her life, she was fine. And then all of a sudden, everything changed. So suddenly jumping into what we talk about more around oldishness, that she kind of jumped back into what life could be and what this moment could be and taking on the adventure.
Yeah, right. Like that second chance kind of thing. It's like, here, I'm going to just ignite my life, the end of my life, and do something unexpected and not oldish. And good thing for Tanner because, she needed somebody to pull her out of her impending oldishness or the rut that Tanner as a young woman was in, trying to reinvent herself and get away from her parents and figure out who the heck she was. And then this young man, August, was like a big part of that, I think, for Tanner. Of course, Louise encourages the romance, right? She's attracted to August herself.
Isn't that fun?
And and historically, I don't think Tanner, as this young woman, had much success with relationships. But on the road to California, Louise contacts August because he always helps her out when she gives the Jaguar away to a waiter because she thinks the police have recognized them. They're having breakfast at a hotel, Tanner and Louise, and they see something on the television report about they're on the run and they're after her. So she assumes that they must know about the Jaguar. So she tells the waiter nothing and calls August and says, you have to come pick us up, take us the rest of the way to California. So then as they travel in that car together for hours, Tanner and August and Louise, who sleeps a lot, they become friends and they share that hotel room the night that Louise decides to have her own room. And it's very risky for Tanner to do something like that, but she really likes this guy. And so she just begins to change. I think that's she really begins to relax in the adventure and say, hey, okay, this is an adventure. I'm going to go with it, So it's sort of interesting how this romantic relationship is such a big step for Tanner towards living life and growing up. Like you said, Greg, she was so immature. And she just didn't know how to behave out in the world on her own.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. So isn't it interesting that there's this coexisting moment, of their becoming. So each of their becomings, which Louise helped along for Tanner around Tanner's relationship with August, by modeling in a way, that she was going to invite this bartender to a hotel room. So they both so Louise got to be herself, and she modeled for Tanner, which is what the option we have in the generations, that the oldish generation has so much to model and be for and with the younger generation.
Well, yeah. I mean, that older, younger generation thing makes me think about, as we age, our relationships between adults and their adult children. And as our adult children begin to assume a caretaker role for us, our roles begin to reverse. Like with Louise's 3 children in the beginning, they wanted her to have a caretaker where all this started in. They feel the need to take care of their mother. Whereas Tanner, she had to leave home before she could reinvent her relationship with her parents. And she really doesn't get around to really do it until the end of the story. Until she grows up a little bit more and she can step aside and see herself as separate from her parents. So I kind of liked that, that was going on, that contrast. I think it can be hard for adult children to accept that their parents, and this is kind of a nice opportunity for discussion, an oldish discussion, Greg, to accept that their parents had a whole life experience before they had children to take care of. And that there are things that the children know nothing about your life before you had kids when you were a young person, being kind of crazy and learn how to grow up. So the question, I suppose, is, as oldish people, should we as oldish parents and people talk more about our lives, our children and our grandchildren before we had children to care for? And are there things that they don't know anything about? I mean, is that worth visiting?
Probably, as long as it's not stories of, when I was your age, I did. But while you're talking, it's coming to me that the modeling, we have an opportunity as oldish people, which, as we've said more than once, that back in the day, there weren't oldish people. There were young, middle-aged, and then old. So we didn't have role models for oldishness, but we can be role models for oldishness. One of the recurring pieces of structure in the novel was text exchanges between Louise's 3 kids. And it just occurred to me that Louise was 84. her three kids are in their late 50s and early 60s. So they are approaching oldishness. And they act like old people. They're all nattering at each other, and they're all, oh, we have to take care of mom. And well, you know how she is. They act old. Whereas Louise doesn't. She has her physical issues, and she dresses old, but she doesn't act like she feels old. So she's kind of modeling oldishness for them, but they were actually the only old people in the book were her three children. And they definitely acted old. The text messages between the three of them were hilarious. They were, in my mind, some of the funniest parts of the book were just how they talked to each other.
That was funny. And I think that one of the important themes for me in the book was the complexity of oldishness. So when we think about her children and how they were trying to figure out how to care for her, that they were looking at her in like a one stroke understanding, stroke of the paintbrush, just that she's old, so she needs help. So that means she needs someone to care for her. So that means she probably needs to go into assisted living, and that all might be true, and that there's more to her than that. I think that's an interesting discussion of how do the adult children figure out how to help their oldish parent and also respect the complexity of their lives, which then comes to what you were saying about, is that something that we as oldish people need to be discussing with our children more around just who we are, the complexity of us? Because they see what we are in this moment, whether it's like Louise with a problematic hip and balance issues, and that's what they were seeing in that moment, but pulling that together with who this person is.
In many ways, this story shines a light on aging and being vulnerable in our culture today. But both of those women, Tanner and Louise, were both vulnerable. As they did their trip, they became more vulnerable with each other, which I thought was interesting. And they both had regrets about their past. They both craved intimacy in their own way, in different ways. They both had complicated relationships with their families and all this vulnerability. And everybody wants to feel secure, especially Louise. For example, I thought that there was one night when Louise had night terrors. I don't know if you remember this, in the hotel room, and she woke up screaming and woke Tanner because they were in the same room, and they talked. And for the first time, you see Louise telling Tanner she has Parkinson's disease and she's afraid about it. She doesn't know what's going to happen. And they talk about their fears, and especially the fear of death of Louise, who you would think she would never really talk about that. And even in that scene, she wasn't extremely open about it. Tanner then, as a young person, also confesses her fear that she's not going to be able to do anything else in life except soccer. And if soccer is the only thing she's good at, who is she? She doesn't have that anymore. So who is she? So they have this really kind of tender moment of sharing their vulnerabilities about their lives going forward. And then it made me start to think about how our culture tends to marginalize elderly people and separating them from society, and the ways that we do that, like in nursing homes and senior housing and assisted living. And we sort of warehouse the elderly altogether. And when you read a book like this, you think, wow, what a missed opportunity to do that. What a missed opportunity we wonder why young people don't look at their seniors or elderly people as an example in life, or to learn that they can learn from them, because we don't have a culture that supports that in a lot of ways anymore.
I wrote down something in the book where it was saying that Tanner's empathy for Louise grew once she could know her better. And I also just had this thought when I'm thinking of Thelma and Louise and how it started out with Louise being the expert and Thelma being the bumbling young person. I wonder if on their road trip, they got to see each other as fellow humans and fellow women, fellow female humans. And then by the end, I don't know whether them deciding to drive off the cliff could relate at all as far as to this book, as far as them saying together, I know I'm stretching this here, but them saying together, we are not going to go into a future that's not allowing us to be who we can be. And I know it's very different as far as where that story goes, but maybe the idea of that these two helped to make their futures, both of them, futures and present and future that they wanted to be in more.
Well, yeah, and they both sort of decided too to go into a future that included each other. Because in the end, Tanner was working at the place where Louise was living in the kitchen. And I thought, wow, it's kind of jumping off a cliff in a way, like saying, okay, I have to figure out my life, but I need this person in my life to kind of still help me out. So Tanner found a way to have a job and have her own apartment and incrementally live her life more independently, but still wanted to have Louise there, who in many ways was really the embodiment of what oldish people strive to be these days. And that is a person who is independent, capable of living fully with their desires and goals and dreams, like right up to the end.
I really like that. And maybe we can close with ending comments. But for me, what just came up for me is that as people age and their adult children are making decisions about what they see their parents as needing, isn't a one-time decision. So, Louise needs to be in added care, and she needs people like Tanner in her life, and she needs to continue to be seen as a complex person. So that rather than, I think a lot of adult children are like, oh, mom looks like she's needing extra help. We're going to put her over here where she'll get the extra help. Okay, done. It's like, no, we need to keep going and keep recognizing what oldish person in our lives, and for us, we are the oldest person in people's lives, what we need. And that is an ongoing process right to the end.
One of the things that I saw in their growing relationship was both of the main characters were really annoyed by their families for similar reasons, but they were both annoyed by their families, and they did something that I've seen, which I think is pretty wonderful, which is they chose their own families. So Louise started to think of Tanner as her granddaughter, and Tanner started to think of Louise as her grandmother, but they were chosen, not born into those roles. And so they could be who they were individually, but they could relate to each other in that grandmother-granddaughter kind of a relationship, but in a richer kind of a way than they were able to do with their own families for whatever reasons. And I'm not advocating that anybody who's oldish goes out and dumps their family and finds some angry kid to open up to and save their lives. But it did seem to me as though that was one of the things that happened toward the end of the book, is that they were choosing each other as family.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And it was a good choice for both of them.
Yeah. Very unlikely.
They both
but
benefited. Yeah. So maybe that's the way to go as you get older, is to be sure that you still have relationships with younger people to enrich your life, and in turn really enrich the life of that young person, because we're all coming and going together in this planet.
Yes.
Yep.
That sounds like a lovely place to end.
Yeah.
So I know we could go on, and because this is such a rich conversation. Any final comments from anyone before we say goodbye? We're all set.
Well, I'd like to say that once again, you two have improved my appreciation of the book that we were talking about. Before we started to record, I was being crotchety, and it's like, I don't know, this book has its moments, but I don't know. It really struck me for the first 2/3 of the book as I was reading it. It was really a Hallmark movie, and it was annoying the heck out of me. But because of your insights, my appreciation of the book has increased tremendously, just as my appreciation of life has increased tremendously just from hanging out with you guys once in a while. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So until next time, we will look forward to Leslie joining us again for our next book. And Leslie, thank you so much for guiding us in this conversation.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
And People listening, we welcome your comments, thoughts, suggestions for books at our website.
The Mostly True Story of Tanner and Louise by Colleen Oakley.
Yes. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for listening.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. We enjoyed our visit and hope you did too. You can leave comments or requests for topics or guests on this or other episodes at www.oldish.me. There's a link there too if you've wondered how you can help support our podcast. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.